Hey guys, I've got some holes that need filling in. Let's build some boxes. So my wife asked me to build some storage boxes for those little cubby things in our kitchen. And as I'm a cheapskate, I wanted to use up some materials I had in the workshop. I found this old piece of hardwood that I'd salvaged at some point from somewhere or other, and it has some hardware attached to it which has definitely seen better days. I prized out the hinge pretty easily and then ran over it with my metal detector and found that there was an end of an old screw in there, so it needed to come out easy, or so I thought. I tried digging it out with an old screwdriver initially, but the wood is really hard, so I tried one of my old chisels. You know the type, one that you use to dig out all sorts of crap and never sharpen. Yeah, that one. I didn't really want to blunt any of my good ones. When that didn't work, I reverted back to the screwdriver and eventually dug out enough so that I could get in there with my needle nose pliers and unscrew it. That was genuinely the hardest bit of this whole task. Now, most YouTube woodworkers I watch, and love by the way, tend to treat hardwood pieces of this size as scrap and just bin or burn them. However, I treat all hardwood as a precious commodity, regardless of how scruffy or small it is, so I'm going to be stretching this piece to the absolute maximum. I can't let any of it go to waste. And as you can see, it's had a hard life. Lots of stains and marks and dings and dents, so I decided the easiest thing to do would be to run it through my planer. And what do you know, it was too wide. No problem though, I just took it to the table saw and ran the edges off. It meant I could cut off those recesses where the hinges were anyway. Once I'd done that, I was able to get it through the planer and took off the surface layers. I'm ridiculously terrible at knowing my wood species, so if anyone has any ideas, please let me know in the comments. Once I'd tidied up both sides, it was time to measure up and see what I was left with. It became clear to me very quickly that I didn't have enough wood to cover the full size that I wanted. But I needed to use this piece up, and I wanted to use the nice hardwood as the front of my boxes. Looking at how neat the grain was, I came up with an idea about how to stretch this piece of wood to the absolute max to get the sizes I need. You'll see what I mean in a bit. So I cut it in half on the miter saw and then marked out how wide I wanted my box front to be. Then I set up a stop block and cut both pieces on the miter saw, so I was left with a smaller section from each end, as you can see. My plan is to join these and use them to extend the wood into a longer piece that is then the correct width. I couldn't have done it with the original length as it would have been too narrow. With the amount of wood I had to work with and the way the grain matches, I felt this would be the best option. To connect the two smaller pieces into a single panel, I mortised out 2 slots for biscuits, making sure to separate them enough that when I cut it in half later, I won't cut through a biscuit. I did the same in the other piece, and then it was just a case of gluing them up and getting them in clamps to set into one single panel. Once dry, I cut the panel in half widthwise on the table saw, which then provided me with 2 pieces that were the same width as my main pieces and had the same grain direction. Then it was back to the biscuit jointer to get them mortised out so I could attach these new pieces to the main panel. I told you I was stretching this to the absolute limit to get what I needed from this single board. Same process, mortise, glue, biscuits, clamps, leave overnight and come back to 2 solid panels. Next up, the main carcasses for the boxes. So I was chatting to a guy called Will recently, shout out Will if you're watching, and he said it'd be quite interesting to see kind of some of the more behind the scenes as to how I get to certain places within my projects and troubleshooting and doing some of the detailed stuff that maybe doesn't get shown in a lot of videos. So I've got this scrap of plywood here that I'm going to use to make the boxes that I'm making for my kitchen, and I'm just trying to figure out whether it will all fit. So my measurements for this are, I want the size, I need 4 sides. They need to be 240 millimeters long by 280 millimeters high. So all I'm going to do really is just have a quick look, see. So I've got 600 millimeters here, which means that I can make the long side on this side. Then this is shorter. This is what, 530, which means that I can get my 480 out of this way. So it means I can cut down the middle and then down the middle, and I'll have all 4 pieces that I need for my sides of my boxes. Then I'm going to have to find another piece to do the back, which I might have something for. The thing that you need to bear in mind when you're doing this is the kerf, which is the thickness of your saw blade. So don't ever just go to the exact measurements, always give a little bit of room extra, and then you can always account for that kerf and then take the difference off anything else if you've got a little bit left over. It's always easy to take material off than to add it back on later on. So all I'm going to do now is set my table saw blade height to the plywood so that I've got some space for it to kick out over the top. I'm going to do the longer bits first, which is 280. I'm just going to take my saw fence, hit that 280 mark. Now I always, as a good practice, line my tape measure up with the tooth, because you get an alternating tooth, bevel tooth on your blade, so it means that one tooth is doing this and one tooth is doing that, so it churns through your wood really well. So what you want is the tooth that's pointing towards your fence, because that's the one that's going to take the closest amount of material off as your measurement. Don't take it from the other one, and make sure you take it from the side that's closest to your fence, because otherwise that kerf will mess with your measurements. So I cut the panels to the 280 millimeters, and then again to the other measurement. I can't remember what I said now, but essentially it gives me my 4 side panels for my 2 boxes. Remember that I'm making this out of scraps in my workshop. Well, now for the base. So I've got this tatty piece of plywood that I'm going to use for my base. It should be fairly easy to clean up, but what I want to do is I want to add a rebate into the end of here. So I've set my table saw blade to halfway up this wood, up the plywood here. Then what I'm going to do is be running it through here and take off the bottom here so that it slots straight over this. So what I need is the thickness of this cut in from the fence. So I need to set the fence the thickness of this piece of wood. Now if I were to just slot this piece of wood in, set my fence, I'd end up being the saw kerf, 2.5 millimeters of the blade, too far in, which would mean that the base would sit 2.5 millimeters higher than the bottom of this piece of wood. So what I want to do is measure the thickness of this and set it from the outside of my blade. The easiest way to do that is to get your square, combination square specifically, because you can set the depth and adjustments, or anything you can measure depth with. Failing that, just use a ruler or a tape measure, but I like to use these because it takes my brain out of the equation, and my brain's not that reliable. So I set that to the thickness of this wood. Then all I need to do is line it up with the tooth. So as before, the widest tooth that's sticking out this way this time, I'll set it up with one of them. Make sure it's touching a couple. Bring my fence in till it's touching the measurement, lock that off, and now I know that when I run this through, including the saw blade, that will take me to the thickness of this material. Let's go. So I ran each piece through with the fence set as I showed you until I'd done the base of all 4 pieces. Then it was just a case of adjusting the fence ever so slightly so that it will take off more material each time until I take the entire section out. You could run it through with your board vertically if you wanted to, but I didn't, so I just ran it through a few times until I finished it. And if you've done it right, then it should fit like this. The benefit of a rebate is that it squares up nicely, and it also provides more glue surface. I did exactly the same to the front panels as well, by the way. Right, so I need to figure out the size to cut this base panel, because I've got my rebates on this. So I'm going to slot the base into here. So I need to figure out the distance between that inside bit to that inside bit plus the front. So the easiest way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to take, that is my full width of my box that I'm making. So I know that is a solid width. So if I measure that, 254 millimeters, and then I know that I've got these sitting on the insides here like this, which will give me my inside rebate. Well, the outside edge of this rebate measures 9 millimeters, so both of those is 18. So then all I need to do is take the 254 of this front board minus the 18, which is 9 of either of these, and that will give me my inside measurement, which is 254 minus 18 is 236. With this measurement, I could set up the table saw and get my base cut to width. I kept it long for the time being and just focused on the width, as I hadn't fully decided how I was doing the back yet. I found another scrap of plywood that I could use for the back, so I dry assembled the box so far and held it in place with a clamp while I marked up where the back would go. I decided to just sit it on top of the base, so I placed it on and marked the height and the width that I needed. Saves having to measure it this way. I then cut it to size and hey presto, perfect fit. I decided that I'd use a few different methods to join this box together, just because it's fun, so I went with pocket holes for the back panel. No one will see it anyway, and my kids love getting involved with drilling pocket holes, and frankly, I love that they're interested in getting involved, so I try and give them the opportunity to do stuff when I can. Once the pocket holes were drilled, I gave each piece a good sanding. And that's enough of that. Next up, I wanted to mark out some handholds in the front panel, so I got my T-square and marked out where I thought it would look best. I ensured that it would be wide and long enough to fit my hand. To cut these out, I drilled the hole in each corner first. I do need a new 10mm drill bit though. Then I used the jigsaw to cut roughly inside my lines to get the bulk of the material out. I wanted to get a really neat rectangle, so I knocked up this quick jig, which is essentially just 4 pieces of straight plywood that I could then clamp to my workpiece and use as a pattern bit on my router to get the exact shape I wanted. Ooh, lovely stuff. Although, I did notice one small problem, which is one of the pitfalls from not working from any plans. I hadn't really thought about the handhold placement when I was gluing it all up, so I ended up being able to see the edges of the biscuits in the hole. Fortunately, because of the way the boxes will be used and where they'll be located, I don't think you'll notice it. I then put a round over bit into the router and just rounded over the handholds on both sides to make it more comfortable when using it. Right, I've used rebates and pocket holes so far, so why not use something else to join the front to the sides? I decided to go with dowels as it wouldn't show any fixings. The first thing I did was to measure out the thickness of the side panels and then to mark the centre of that point onto the back edges of my front panel. I then used this measurement as a rough gauge to set the fence on my doweling jig. I set the drill collar so that the bit stops just short of the front to avoid going all the way through. I tend to just stick it in the jig itself and then line it up where I think it needs to be and tighten it down. I then needed to mark out where the dowels were going. I decided to do 3 on each side, so I got these marked up on the front panel and I transferred them to the front edges of the side panels. Then it was just a case of getting them drilled. I like to put the drill bit in first and touch it to the mark on my wood so that I can drop the jig onto it and drill the hole. And there's all 6 holes drilled. Next up, I needed to set my drill for the depth into the side panels. So I dropped a dowel into the hole I drilled and marked it so that I could use this to set my drill depth to a tad deeper than it needs to be, and then went to work on drilling the 6 holes, 3 in each side. Right, now it's time to assemble. I added glue to each dowel hole and then plopped a cheeky dowel in each one. Then I added a bead of glue into the edge of each side panel and dropped that onto the dowels. The problem I find with dowel joinery is that it requires a level of precision that is sometimes difficult to achieve, whereas with something like a domino, you get the adjustability of drilling a wider mortise on one piece. But for the extra 1500 quid compared to this dowel jig, I think I'll maybe wait a little while before I get a domino. It all went together okay, but needed some persuasion as it's a pretty tight fit. The other side went on in the same way as well, nice and tight. Then I added the glue to the rebates and smushed it all around so I could add the base panel. Oh yeah, I cut the base to length at some point too, but obviously didn't film it. With just a bit more pressure and hammering, I got the sides fully seated on the dowels and then just pinned everything in place with my brad nailer while the glue dries. I recently did a review on this nail gun, so I'll link to it in the description. Then I added the glue to the pocket hole joints and got the pocket screws added. This little pocket corner clamp thingy has been really useful. I use it quite a lot now, so I'll put a link to that in the description as well. Then I clamped the front panel nice and tight to the rest of the box as I didn't want to add any nails or anything to it. Ooh, lovely bit of squeeze out. Then I gave the entire box another sanding down with 120 grit. Now, it's time for me to fess up. On the second box, typically the one I wasn't filming, for some reason I decided that I needed to just drill a little bit further for one of my dowels. I don't know if it was too long or what, but instead of drilling further into the side panel, I decided that the front was the way to go. Anyway, long story short, I accidentally went too deep and drilled a bloody hole in the front. So in order to fix it, I drilled a plug out of one of the offcuts from cutting the handhole and then I glued that in place. Let's not call it fixing a mistake, let's call it giving it character. At least you know it's handmade. Once I'd given it some character, I added a few coats of varnish, de-nibbing between coats. This actually helped hide the plug repair a little bit more as well. And there we go. A couple of simple boxes, really easy project that hopefully you can do at home. If you enjoyed this project, then you might want to try this simple project next. See you next time.